The Forgotten Tragedy of the Whispering Pines Orphanage, Vermont, 1889, is a work of dark historical horror fiction. The story is inspired by real folklore, superstitions, and orphanage conditions of 19th-century New England, but all characters, locations, and events are entirely fictional. Some themes explored include child disappearances, psychological torment, supernatural possession, and ritualistic horror. Due to graphic and emotionally disturbing content, this story is not suitable for sensitive audiences or children. Listener discretion is strongly advised. In the autumn of 1883, when Vermont's forests were just beginning to burn with the colors of fall, a woman by the name of Abigail Marrow arrived in the remote village of Cold Hollow. With her came a large entourage. 3 covered wagons filled with building supplies, crates of furniture, and a handful of strangers no one in town recognized. She bought the old Blackridge estate, an abandoned colonial mansion deep within the Whispering Pines, a dense woodland feared by the locals. The estate had been left to rot for over 2 decades after its last owner, a timber baron, and his family disappeared without a trace. No bodies were ever found, just shattered windows, claw marks on walls, and doors that refused to stay shut. Cold Hollow's older residents claimed the land was cursed. The younger ones simply avoided it. But Abigail was different. She wasn't just a stranger. She was a mystery. The townsfolk whispered that she had once been a nurse at a Boston asylum. Others said she was a grieving mother who had lost her child and had never recovered. No one knew the truth. What they did know was that she was building something strange. Within weeks, the Blackridge estate was cleaned, reinforced, and repainted. Its windows glowed with candlelight. Fresh curtains billowed behind the glass. Smoke curled from the chimney. And then, a brass plaque was nailed to the front gate. The Whispering Pines Orphanage, St. 1883. 12 children were brought in, some from local poorhouses, some from far-off towns. Boys and girls between the ages of 5 and 12. Most were quiet, thin, and frightened. They had no families, no pasts, and now no way out. Strange rules governed the orphanage. Children were not allowed to leave the estate's grounds, even to visit town. No mirrors were permitted in the bedrooms. Every child had to sleep with their window open no matter the weather. And every evening, precisely at midnight, the children had to gather in the great hall and sing the same old lullaby, one that none of them remembered learning. Locals who passed by the grounds at night often reported hearing that strange, humming tune, carried eerily through the trees, accompanied by rustling pine needles even when there was no wind. Some even claimed they saw shapes in the trees, watching from the darkness. But no one ever dared investigate. One housekeeper, a middle-aged widow named Eunice Carr, began to notice oddities during her first month. Every morning, she found pine needles scattered on the floor of the children's rooms, despite the windows being shut tight. Sometimes the bedsheets were damp with mud, and tiny footprints led in and out of the rooms. She reported it to Abigail, but Abigail dismissed it with a smile and said, "They walk in their dreams, and the forest watches over them." Still, the children were quiet, too quiet. They rarely spoke. They never laughed. They stared at corners, ceilings, and each other for long stretches of time without blinking. One girl, Lily, age 6, had to be locked in her room after she was caught digging holes in the floorboards with her bare hands. She whispered, "They want out. They don't like the stone beneath." The other staff members started quitting. The cook left after claiming he saw one of the boys chewing on a pine cone filled with blood. The groundskeeper ran off screaming one morning after discovering rows of teeth planted like seeds in the garden. But Abigail remained calm. Always calm. She kept a red leather book she never let out of sight. It smelled of ash and sap, and she was often seen reading it by candlelight in the attic, muttering to herself in a tongue no one recognized. By the start of winter, the orphanage was down to only 2 adult staff members, Abigail and Eunice. But the number of children remained the same, 12. Always 12. Then came the night of the first storm, the snow thick and choking, the sky black as pitch. Eunice heard whispers coming from the forest, not from children, but something older, something layered, echoing, inhuman. She tried to leave the next morning. She never made it out of the forest. Her journal was found weeks later, stuffed into a hollow tree trunk near the edge of Cold Hollow. Its last written page, torn and smeared with sap, simply read, "The pines do not forget. They only wait." Winter had sealed Whispering Pines Orphanage from the outside world. Thick snowbanks buried the dirt roads, and the trees, now stripped of leaves, leaned inward as if trying to listen. Even in daylight, the grounds felt cloaked in dusk. Inside, the candlelight flickered, and the children moved like shadows. Since Eunice's disappearance, Abigail Merrow ran the orphanage alone. No new staff came. No one from the town visited. The children obeyed every rule without resistance, never speaking unless spoken to, always singing the lullaby, and keeping their windows open even as ice formed on the panes. But by the third week of winter, something began to change. It started with the walls. At night, faint tapping sounds echoed through the hallways, too rhythmic for rats, too deliberate for wind. The children said nothing about it. But one boy, Oliver, age 9, was caught kneeling beside the wall of the boys' dormitory, ear pressed to the wood, whispering back. When Abigail confronted him, he replied, "They're teaching me new names, old ones, Pineborn." He was locked in the root cellar for a day. When he was let out, he hadn't moved. His lips were blue, but his breath was warm. He emerged humming a new verse of the lullaby, one not written in the orphanage's hymnal. Soon after, more children began to act strange. Margaret, the oldest girl, was seen standing barefoot in the snow for hours, staring into the trees. When asked why, she replied, "I had to count them. If one goes missing, we all will." 2 boys began drawing the same symbol on everything: bedposts, tables, even on their own arms using ink and needles. The symbol looked like a tree with eyes at the ends of its branches, dripping red. At night, a low, wooden groaning would travel through the house, like a floorboard being dragged across stone. But it came from inside the walls, crawling room to room. The house itself seemed to be responding. Doors no longer opened to the same rooms. The upstairs hall would stretch or shrink. Clocks stopped keeping proper time, some ticking backwards, others skipping whole minutes. One night, during the children's midnight singing, Abigail interrupted them for the first time. She shouted, "You've added new words. Who taught you that?" The children simply smiled all at once. Abigail ran upstairs and tore open the red leather book. That night, she burned the original hymnal. But from the ashes in the fireplace, shapes rose, little ashen hands that clawed the air before collapsing. Desperate for clarity, Abigail began conducting midnight interviews with each child. She asked them about the voices, the new words, the drawings, the names. But every single child told her the same thing: "We don't remember." That was the phrase, always spoken with the exact same tone, the same pause, rehearsed. She searched the rooms for signs of foul play, perhaps someone sneaking onto the grounds, whispering to the children through windows. But the snow outside was untouched. No footprints, no broken twigs. She began boarding up the windows herself. But by morning they were open again, without a sound, without a tool. The wood peeled off and neatly stacked beside each window as if placed by careful, gentle hands. It was then that Abigail discovered something more disturbing. One evening, while cleaning the boys' dormitory, she noticed a pattern. 12 beds, perfectly made, but always one pillow too many. She began counting again and again, 13 pillows, 12 children. Every night, she started marking them, tearing corners, burning the extras. But the 13th pillow would always return, untouched. And then came the first drawing on the wall. It wasn't made with chalk, pencil, or ink, but something darker, something sticky, a child's handprint, smeared in concentric circles. Abigail touched it with her bare hand and collapsed, whispering in a language she didn't know. When she awoke hours later, she had scrawled a message on the attic wall. "He who speaks beneath the bark watches through the children's mouths." She didn't remember writing it. The next night, the lullaby grew louder, deeper, with voices that didn't belong to any of the children. They were adult voices, male and female, weeping, gasping, whispering. And then the chimney cracked open. From it, not soot but pine needles fell, soaked in something red, thick and warm. The smell was iron-rich. One of the boys clapped his hands and said, "He liked the offering." That night, Abigail didn't sleep. She read the red leather book from cover to cover and discovered its name for the first time, the Root God's Gospel. It spoke of ancient rituals once performed by the Abenaki tribes, of a forest god buried beneath the pines, demanding the voices of children to awaken. The book warned, if 13 sing beneath the hollow moon, the roots will bleed and the mouth will open. Abigail realized something terrifying. There were still only 12 children, but the house believed there were 13. By the second month of that brutal Vermont winter, the orphanage had grown impossibly silent. The kind of silence that hums in the ears, that smothers thought, that settles in the bones. Abigail Marrow, once calm and poised, now looked hollow-eyed and twitchy. She locked her room every night, prayed at odd hours, and carried the red leather book like a shield. But the silence didn't last, because the children began to disappear. It started with Lily, the youngest, the same girl who once dug into the floorboards with her fingers. One morning, her bed was empty. The sheets were neatly folded, and her nightgown was placed on the pillow. But her boots, muddy from the previous night, were missing. Abigail searched the house, top to bottom. No sign. She dared the forest too, but found nothing. No prints. No blood, just the cold whisper of the trees, like they were breathing in rhythm. The next night, Lily came back. She walked through the front door without making a sound. Hair damp, skin cold. Her eyes no longer blinked. Her mouth didn't move when she spoke. She simply said, "I found my real family. They live beneath the dirt. They showed me how to never be lonely again." And then she went to bed. From that night on, she never smiled. Never laughed. She no longer played with the others. She sat near the window and whispered names to the trees. When Abigail tried to question her, Lily didn't respond, just turned her head and smiled too wide. 3 nights later, it happened again. Tommy, one of the more mischievous boys, vanished from the dining hall. His spoon still clattered on the floor. They found his boots on the stairwell, and his coat swinging gently from a nail, as if someone had just removed it. He returned 2 days later, clothed in burlap, dirt in his teeth, and scars across his arms shaped like tree rings. He no longer responded to his name. He only called himself Thorn, and he wasn't the last. Children began disappearing regularly, sometimes only for hours, sometimes for days. But every time they returned, they were changed. One girl would only speak in riddles, referencing the hollow tongue. A boy refused to walk on wooden floors, saying, "It hurts him when I step." 2 twins no longer slept, claiming they were being taught to dream while awake. The change wasn't just in behavior. It was physical, too. Abigail noticed subtle shifts. Fingers slightly longer, pupils too wide. One girl's shadow no longer matched her movements, tilting before she did, or freezing when she walked. She began keeping a journal, detailing each disappearance, each return. She marked the changes. She counted the nights between vanishings. Pattern emerged. Every 13th night, a child would go missing. And every 13th return, one would come back not at all. By late January, 2 of the original 12 children were unaccounted for. But still, there were 12 children in the house. Abigail, horrified, began searching for records, old newspapers, anything to explain what was happening. She found an article from 1821, a single column buried in the Cold Hollow Gazette. It described a mass disappearance of 13 children from a Quaker school near the same area. The article ended with this line, 13 were taken, 12 were returned, but the 13th kept the forest alive. Abigail made a chilling connection. Was one child never meant to exist at all? Or had something else inhabited the house, disguised as a 13th child? She confronted the children one by one, but none of them could recall how long they'd been there, not even their own birthdays. They all said the same thing, "We've always lived here." We are the forest's memory. Desperate, Abigail locked the children in their rooms and began reading the root god's gospel aloud, chanting protection verses, counter-rituals. The house responded violently. Books flew off shelves. The fire erupted green. The floorboards creaked open like mouths, and from the walls came a voice not human. Return the borrowed mouths, Abigail. Your debt is due. She collapsed, blood trickling from her ears. When she awoke, she was no longer alone in her room. There was a child standing in the corner, taller than any of the others, face hidden in the dark, but breathing. She asked his name. He said nothing, just walked to her nightstand, opened her journal and wrote, "You counted wrong. There were never 12. And then he vanished into the walls. By the first thaw of February, the townspeople noticed something strange. The orphanage windows were still open, even during blizzards. At night, they saw silhouettes standing in rows behind the glass, perfectly still, humming in unison. Always 13 figures. But Abigail no longer answered the door. No letters came. No deliveries were accepted. No smoke from the chimney. Just the faint rustle of trees. And the lullaby. Always the lullaby. The winter sun, weak and fleeting, did little to illuminate the growing darkness inside the Whispering Pines Orphanage. By February's end, the air in the house had grown thick, heavy. Not with smoke or dust, but with a presence, as if the walls themselves were breathing, watching, waiting. Abigail Marrow had stopped sleeping. Her once-kept appearance had deteriorated. Hair unkempt, fingernails blackened from clawing through floorboards, and dark rings under her eyes like bruises from unseen fists. She kept the red leather book chained to her belt, muttering to it constantly, as if it whispered back. She no longer trusted any of the children. They wandered the halls at night, their steps too quiet, their eyes too wide. They stared into corners for hours. They ate in silence, always finishing every bite. Even the pickiest ones. Even the ones who once wept during meals. And when they smiled now, it was wrong. Too knowing. Too sharp. Abigail began to suspect something horrifying. That these weren't children anymore. They were something else. Vessels. And the house was no longer just wood and stone. It was a temple. One night, while cleaning the attic in a rare moment of lucidity, Abigail found something strange behind a false wall panel. A second altar. It was made of twisted pine roots, arranged into a spiral pattern. The center burned black. Around the base were 13 small jawbones, each etched with strange symbols. Some had teeth still attached, baby teeth. Pinned beside it was an old, yellowed letter, dated 1781, written by a man named Josiah Blackridge, the original owner of the estate. The letter detailed the 13th night ritual, a rite believed to appease the forest mouth, a god of roots and memory. Josiah described the necessity of 13 vessels, the sacred lullaby, and the planting of blood beneath pine saplings. Abigail trembled as she read the final line. Only with the borrowed breath of children can the forest remember its name. That night, she watched the children from the attic. They gathered in the great hall as always at midnight. But this time they weren't alone. A 14th figure stood among them. Not a child. Not human. A silhouette taller than the rest, its limbs unnaturally long, its head slightly tilted, as if listening to a sound from underground. When Abigail blinked, it was gone. But the children had stopped singing. They now chanted in a guttural tone, mouths wide, voices overlapping like a hive. She screamed, but no one looked up. Desperate to end this, Abigail turned to the root god's gospel and prepared the counter-rite of severing, a dangerous ritual that promised to banish the one who watches from beneath. It required 13 artifacts, one from each child, and blood willingly offered by the keeper of the house. She began collecting a burned lock of hair, a blood-stained pine cone, a tooth hidden under a bed, a drawing etched on skin, the sound of a name spoken backward, the ashes of a lullaby's page. 13 in all, except one, the final artifact, the 13th child. But who was the 13th? Abigail no longer knew. She compared records, journals, names, but every list ended in 12. Still, 13 children roamed the halls. Always 13. That night, she performed the severing ritual in the attic. She spilled her own blood, poured sap into a circle, lit candles made from wax she found behind the chapel walls, ones that smelled like soil and teeth. As the ritual climaxed, a wind burst through the attic, extinguishing every candle. The pine altar trembled, the walls cracked, and then a voice. It did not echo from outside. It did not speak from the throat. It bloomed inside her mind, ancient and slow. You broke the circle, Abigail. You tried to count the forest. But you forgot. Roots do not end. The children appeared behind her, 13 of them, their faces expressionless, eyes pale and pupilless. They opened their mouths in perfect unison and exhaled. What came out was not breath, but fog, thick, black, and alive. It wrapped around Abigail like vines, lifted her from the floor, and pulled her upward into the shadows of the attic ceiling. When the fog receded, she was gone, and in her place stood a new child, a boy no one had ever seen before, his face blank, his eyes reflecting candlelight that was no longer there. He turned to the others and whispered, "Now we are 13 again." The next morning, the windows were all closed for the first time since the orphanage had opened. But etched into each window pane, almost invisible unless the light hit just right, was a name. Abigail Marrow. A new child's name was added to the roster that week in ink that bled through the page. No one noticed. The winter of 1889 began to loosen its grip, and as March arrived, the snow around Whispering Pines Orphanage began to melt. Trees, once bare and lifeless, leaned inward, whispering secrets through pine needles slick with thaw. But inside the orphanage, the warmth of spring never came. What unfolded in those final days was never published, never archived, and never spoken of publicly again. Not in Cold Hollow. Not in Vermont. The few who witnessed it refused to speak. Those who tried didn't live long after. But in fragments, charred journals, water-damaged letters, and a single survivor's drawings, we can piece together the forgotten horror known only as the March Blackening. It began on March 13th, the 13th month since the orphanage opened, the 13th day of the moon's hollow cycle. 13 children, now utterly silent, dressed themselves in identical white garments, clothing no one remembered sewing. Each child wore a garland of pine needles and thorns upon their head. Their faces were painted with sap and ash, drawn in symbols Abigail had once forbidden. They gathered in the great hall at midnight without being summoned. They did not sing. They stood, perfectly still. The house changed. Doors shut without hands. Lights blew out. The floorboards pulsed beneath the children's feet like a heartbeat. The walls groaned and cracked open, revealing roots where there should have been stone. The forest moved in. Vines slithered down the chimney. Sap dripped from the ceiling like blood from a wound. Every mirror in the house shattered simultaneously, though none had been installed for months. The air turned sweet, thick, rotting. And that's when the staff began to die. Thomas Blythe, the new caretaker, was the first. His body was found strung up in the dining hall, his tongue nailed to the wooden beam above the fireplace. His boots were filled with wet pine cones. His eyes were missing, replaced by white stones smoothed by river water. Sister Anne, the interim headmistress after Abigail's disappearance, was found in the chapel, her mouth stuffed with hymn pages, her wrists bound with rosary beads. Her heart was gone, and in its place was a single child's tooth nestled in pine resin. No screams were heard. No one tried to run. The remaining staff simply vanished, one by one. The children did not react. They simply moved to the next room, then the next, performing the ritual in silence. The great hall was transformed into a temple. Candles appeared lit without flame. Roots broke through the wooden floor, forming a spiral pattern from the altar to the walls. In the center of the spiral, a hole, small at first, then widening, growing, breathing. The mouth had opened. Outside, villagers in Cold Hollow saw the sky above the orphanage darken, though no clouds had formed. Animals screamed from the forest and fled downhill into the village. The church bell began ringing on its own, and all 13 windows of the orphanage glowed with pulsing, red light. No one dared approach. The next morning, the forest fell deathly still. The sky cleared. The smoke vanished. A traveling priest, Father William Jeru, arrived in Cold Hollow that afternoon, unaware of the horror that had transpired. He agreed to investigate after the villagers refused. Armed with his crucifix, a flask of holy water, and deep skepticism, he walked the 3 miles to the orphanage. He never returned. But days later, his journal was found on the edge of the forest, tucked beneath a twisted root. It was water-damaged, stained with dark blotches. But a few final pages survived. The house is empty but full. I hear laughter, thin and layered, like wind through cracked bone. There is no furniture, only teeth, teeth everywhere, embedded in the walls. The children, they are inside the walls now, singing. One of them spoke to me without moving its mouth, said, "We are the blood memory. You are the mouth. And now you must swallow." He described descending into the cellar and finding a pit, deep and lined with mirrors that did not reflect him. Only the orphanage burning again and again. His final entry simply read, "It has learned how to wear faces. Even mine." 3 weeks passed. When state officials were finally pressured to investigate, they found the building intact, but empty. No blood, no bodies, no children, just 13 beds made perfectly. Each pillow embroidered with a different symbol. Each symbol found carved into the pines outside, over and over and over. The cellar door was sealed with wax and chains made of human hair. It was never opened. The property was officially condemned. The land sold back to the state. No one claimed the building. No legal documents regarding the orphanage survived. Cold Hollow buried the story. No newspapers covered it. The Gazette office burned down mysteriously 3 days after the story was drafted. But one survivor remained. A boy, age unknown, name redacted, was found wandering a highway 20 miles from Cold Hollow. He did not speak, would not eat, only drew. Hundreds of drawings, always in 13ths. 13 doors, 13 mouths, 13 trees, 13 children with black sap dripping from their eyes. When asked where he came from, he finally whispered one thing. "The mouth chewed them all, but I climbed out through its tongue." He died in an asylum weeks later. A pine tree grew through his grave. No one planted it. In the summer of 1967, nearly 80 years after the tragedy at Whispering Pines Orphanage, a young archivist named Daniel Prescott was hired by the Vermont Historical Society to digitize forgotten records. The task was simple: scan, file, and destroy duplicates of old land deeds, census logs, and colonial letters that filled a basement no one had entered for decades. But Daniel was curious. Too curious. Late one evening, in the farthest corner of the damp archive room, behind a rusted cabinet of unmarked folders, he found a box, unlabeled, locked, and cold to the touch. The lock broke easily. Inside, he found a bundle of stained letters tied in red twine, a worn leather journal with the initials AM, an audio reel labeled, "Do Not Play, property of Cold Hollow Sheriff's Department 1890, and a single photograph, sepia-toned, frayed at the edges, of 13 children standing in front of a building buried in pine trees. None were smiling. All of them had completely black eyes. At first, Daniel thought he had stumbled upon a forgotten local ghost story. But as he read the letters, scanned the journal, and studied the photograph, his intrigue curdled into dread. The letters were written by Abigail Marrow. Her words chronicled the transformation of the children, her descent into madness, and the discovery of something older than time itself beneath the orphanage. They were not born. They were remembered. The forest does not forget its children. The journal, preserved surprisingly well, contained sketches, diagrams of the spiral altar, pages of the lullaby in strange languages, and crude maps marking where each child had vanished. The final page was torn in half, but a single phrase remained: "He walks again when roots kiss ash." Daniel's hands trembled. His pulse quickened. He was no longer dealing with folklore. He had found evidence of something real. Against all warnings, Daniel played the reel-to-reel tape in the archive's sound lab. It began with crackling, static, then a soft humming. Children singing, off-key, unnatural, then screaming, not of pain, but of something being pulled apart from within, like a body losing its shape. Words emerged, spoken not by a child, but something that used a child's mouth. We fed the trees. We drank her blood. The 13th was the key. Now we wait for the new name. The tape ended with 13 knocks, slow and hollow, echoing like fists against a coffin lid. Daniel was never the same. Over the following weeks, he became obsessed. He skipped shifts, stopped eating, started pinning photographs and drawings across the archive walls. He contacted historians, folklorists, even local priests, but none had ever heard of Whispering Pines. It was as if the entire place had been erased. One rainy afternoon, he drove to Cold Hollow. But the town had changed. The locals were cold, tight-lipped. No one would speak about the orphanage. Most claimed it never existed. One old woman, eyes milky with age, grabbed his wrist and said, "It still remembers you. Don't let it say your name." He found the path through the woods, overgrown, hidden, as if nature itself had tried to swallow the road. But Daniel pushed forward, guided by a pull, one he couldn't explain. He found the ruins of the orphanage beneath a canopy of twisted trees. The structure was half collapsed, eaten by vines, its windows broken. Yet inside, the furniture was untouched. 13 beds still made, 13 plates stacked neatly. The fireplace was cold, but in the ashes he found teeth. He set up a recorder, took photographs, and even made audio notes. Then he disappeared. Weeks later, a park ranger found his car at the edge of the forest, engine cold, doors unlocked. Inside was a map drawn in Daniel's handwriting, marked, "He sleeps here," with a spiral circling the old estate. No one searched the ruins. But 2 months later, a package arrived at the Vermont Historical Society. No return address, no note. Inside was Daniel's recorder. The tape played only once before it erased itself. It contained the sound of Daniel speaking, at first nervously, then chanting. His last clear words were, "It has no eyes but sees. It has no mouth but sings. And now it knows my name." Then came static. Then a single child's laugh looping over and over. Today, Daniel Prescott is listed as a missing person. His case remains unsolved. But the archives he unlocked, they've since been reboxed, sealed again. And on every label, in handwriting no one remembers writing, are the same 3 words, "Do not disturb." Decades passed. The world changed. But the forest near Cold Hollow, Vermont, remained untouched, wild, dark, and indifferent. Locals never spoke of the orphanage. Maps didn't mark the area. GPS devices failed near its coordinates. And yet, every year people still found it. Campers, hikers, urban explorers, thrill-seeking teenagers with video cameras and ghost-hunting gear. None of them had heard the full story. None knew what they were walking into, and some never came back out. In 1984, a trio of college students from Brattleboro filmed their hike into the Cold Hollow woods. The recovered VHS tape, later found in a waterlogged backpack near a ravine, captured their slow descent into madness. In the footage, they find the stone foundation of the orphanage. They hear faint children's laughter, even though no one else is visible. One student begins bleeding from his ears after touching a pine tree carved with symbols. The tape ends with the camera resting on the forest floor, pointed up at 13 children standing in a circle, surrounding the lens. Their bodies were never recovered. In 1997, a wildlife photographer snapped a shot of a deer in the mist. But when developed, there was something else in the background. 13 pale figures among the trees, all facing the camera. All wearing what looked like turn-of-the-century children's clothing. Their eyes were completely black. He burned the photo, then drove off the side of a bridge a week later. In 2006, a popular true crime podcaster named Elsie Greer released an episode titled The Unnamed Orphanage of Vermont. It featured clips from the Daniel Prescott tape, along with her own attempts to find the ruins. The episode ended with her breathless voice recording, "I found the basement. I found the spiral. There's a door beneath the dirt. Something's knocking back." Her podcast was deleted from all platforms within hours. Her laptop was found fused shut. Her house caught fire the same night. She was never seen again. Residents of Cold Hollow keep quiet. But the stories trickle out. A hunter who saw a child with no shadow sitting in a pine tree. A woman who followed a trail of pine cones to find her missing dog and found a doll made of teeth. A drone operator who captured aerial footage of the orphanage ruins, only to find the trees rearranging themselves into a spiral pattern from above. A child in town who began drawing black-eyed kids in her notebook after a school field trip to the woods, despite never leaving the bus. One elderly man, the last living relative of a Cold Hollow sheriff, told a tourist, "It still breathes, you know, the forest. It sings under the snow. Don't listen. Don't count the voices. That's how it gets you. And the forest still protects its secret." Phones die. Compasses spin. Time warps. People report being lost for hours, only to emerge minutes later, covered in sap and missing shoes. Others claim to see the same child in different places at the same time. One woman claimed she followed her daughter into the woods, only to find 13 identical versions of her standing in a circle. Only one spoke. "Pick the real me before the mouth opens again." She ran. She returned with no daughter. And then there are the dreams. Those who spend too long near the forest edge report vivid nightmares. Of children crawling out of tree trunks. Of a woman in a nurse's uniform, reading a red book backwards. Of a staircase that leads into the earth, deeper and deeper, until it ends in a mouth made of stone and root. And always the lullaby. It has no lyrics, no melody that sticks, but everyone who hears it agrees. It sounds like it's trying to remember your name. Some say it's just local folklore, just stories, just fear passed down and fed with time. But if that were true, why does no one build near those woods? Why do the trees there never fall? Why are there always 13 deer in every photograph? Why do maps still go missing? And why, in the Vermont Historical Society archives, are the words 13th breath carved into the concrete wall behind a locked door? On the inside, there was once a time when everything surrounding the Whispering Pines Orphanage was myth, folklore, perhaps, built on tragedy. But in 2023, a dying woman in a Vermont hospice care facility changed that forever. Her name was Clara Eloise Dunn. She was 102 years old, and she had a secret. Clara had been a nurse's assistant in 1932 at a now-demolished psychiatric ward in Montpelier. There, she cared for a nameless boy, mute, emaciated, eyes always staring at corners no one else saw. He never spoke, never slept, never blinked. But every night he drew hundreds of sketches. Always 13 children, always black-eyed, always standing in a circle around something that looked like a tree, a hole, and a face, all at once. When she retired in 1979, Clara kept those drawings, unable to destroy them. They haunted her, but they also felt true. She stored them in a locked box under her bed. She never told anyone until she was near death. In her final days, Clara requested a priest, not for confession, but for testimony. She claimed the boy she cared for was the 13th child, the one that never returned properly. She said she had visited the ruins of Whispering Pines in 1947 and saw things that broke her mind. A tree bleeding from its bark. A shadow crawling on all fours whispering prayers. A bed still made, though no roof remained. A red leather book, open on the altar, its pages flipping in a wind that didn't exist. She said she tried to burn the drawings once. They didn't catch fire. That was when she knew. He wasn't dead. He was buried awake. Not beneath soil, but beneath the memory of the forest. Clara's final act was to send the drawings, along with a handwritten confession, to the Vermont Office of Historical Affairs, marked to be opened upon my death only. They were opened in 2024. The drawings were identical to those in Abigail Marrow's journal and Daniel Prescott's recovered files. The handwriting was the same as the boy who had vanished in 1889, confirmed through forensic comparison. Clara's story went public. Within weeks, the internet exploded with theories, expeditions, and digital sleuths hunting for the ruins. Thousands of eyes turned to Cold Hollow. Journalists, YouTubers, podcasters, TikTokers, historians. The forest noticed. The awakening began quietly. A hiker went missing. Then two. Their gear was found, but their bodies were not. One drone operator live-streamed the forest before his signal died. The final frame showed the tops of pine trees slowly bending inward, forming a spiral. A documentary crew from Montreal released a trailer for Whispers in the Pines, featuring real-time EVP sessions. At the end of the teaser, a child's voice whispered, "Do you want to see where we keep your name?" The crew vanished 2 weeks later. Only the trailer remains online. Then, in October 2024, a town-wide blackout struck Cold Hollow. No one could enter. No one could leave. Phones died. Roads cracked open. Roots burst from pavement like veins through skin. Locals reported seeing a man-shaped figure made entirely of bark, blood, and bone. Its face empty, except for a wide mouth carved like a grin. He stood at the old site of the orphanage, beneath a stormless sky, surrounded by 13 children, all smiling, all humming. For 13 minutes, the air turned heavy. Wind stopped. Birds vanished. The trees breathed in. Then silence. When the power returned, the ruins were gone. Not destroyed, erased, as if they had never been there at all. The pine god, long buried, long starved, was no longer asleep. Clara had warned them in her final page. When the 13th vessel is remembered, not found, and when his name is spoken by accident, he will bloom from the roots and sing the world back to silence. Today, Cold Hollow is abandoned. Satellite images show no trees where the forest once stood. Just a black spiral burned into the earth, 50 feet wide. The air there crackles. Radios go dead. And the wind sounds like a child humming a lullaby. 13 notes. No melody. Just memory. And if you dream of the orphanage, if you see the 13 beds, if you hear the whisper through the pines, don't answer. Don't sing back. Don't speak your name. Because once the forest knows who you are already one of them. And the mouth never closes.